Indeed. Very, very nice to be here. I'm going to do this sitting down, if that's okay for everybody. I know we're all kind of slightly distributed in the council room, and like all good university meetings, nobody's in the front row except for the most important person. So I'm going to pick up this thing, as we see in the title, about storytelling and about narrative, as Tim was just saying, and give some observations about how this works for the climate and other kind of crises that we face at the moment. There's no PowerPoint, even though that thing is shining behind us. It's all just words I'm going to use here. So maybe a little bit unusual, but I want to see how this works and relate a bit at a kind of, you know, high meta level of what talking about these things means in public contexts. And how I've been trying to navigate through that. So I want to kind of reveal a little bit. So I'm talking directly to you, but also kind of at another level. So I want to weave together ideas about the climate crisis, ecological, social inequality, all these other big things, food, energy, democracy, and so forth, that affect us at the moment. But then let's say, how do we think about these things? What words do we use? How do we create forms of words, narratives that lead to action? So I'm interested in agency. We've got this in the title. We can talk about these things, but if we don't change stuff, we're failing in some sort of way. So there is a normative element. I'm trying to kind of say to us, you know what, let's do something a bit different. So in short, can we escape the flooded city, the heat, the drought, the rising seas? All of those kind of big things that are at the front of our minds. Bertolt Brecht in 1939 said, in the dark times, will there also be singing? And he said, yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. And of course, he was facing a particular kind of set of problems at that point. The singing is the stories. So we might feel we're in dark times, but it's even more important that we create kind of narratives about that and what good looks like and how we get from A to B. So that's really kind of the core of my current interests. I'm going to there's another leaflet that's been given to you all called this 30 for 30, cutting carbon. This is about agency, and I'm going to come to this towards the end of the talk. So coming back to that, and this is another form of storytelling. As Tim said, the Sea Sagas of the North book, which has just been published, is about stories and tales of the North Sea and the East and North Atlantic, following a kind of arc from Iceland, Norway, Denmark, around to the east of England, to the north, to the Scottish Isles, to Faroes, and back to Iceland again. And every kind of community that looks inward towards this sea sees commonalities with other places across the water. And over again, the ecological system that we see as the North Sea and the East and North Atlantic holds common cultural context because of the fishing, the travel, and the transport across the seas, much more so than they did inland. Quite early on, I was speaking to an old skipper in Lowestoft, at the Sparrow's Nest, if you know Lowestoft at all well. Famous skipper, 80 years old, been on the boat since he was 12, famous drifter skipper, then a trawler skipper. And he said to me, he said, you know, boy, in good kind of Lowestoft accent, you know, boy, we were much more kind and tolerant in those days when we had the fishing. Because we traveled from here to other places and established friendships and contacts and came back with stories and gifts from all of these places around the North Sea. So people saw themselves as having more in common. He had more in common with remote Icelandic villages than he did with Beccles. Okay, 10 miles inland, that's a remote country to me, he says. But I know about these places across the sea. So it challenges the way that we think about kind of geography and context between people and the commonalities of stories. Every kind of place that has had use of the resources in the sea, in this area, has commonalities with other places. because of their location. So I was kind of interested in these notions of kindness, of gifts, and also of hope. And I want to come back to this in a little while. The notion that in the middle of these really big crises, we have to find a form of language which makes us feel that taking action is worthwhile, that there is some hope in what we wish to do. So let me say just a little bit about kind of the climate crisis and the way that I'm trying to kind of navigate this. In the last 6 months, I've given 30 talks in the region. I chair a climate action commission for Essex County, which has 40 members, produced 100 recommendations for the county, which also apply to other kind of areas. We got every political party in the county, which has a particular political view in Essex, to agree to all 100 recommendations in NEMCOM. That was a quite kind of important political moment. So there's quite a lot happening. The way that I would look at this is to say that actually I think something big has changed during and after COVID. I know we're not strictly after it, but we're after the lockdowns and the pandemic. It's amazing to think it's 3 years, isn't it? We look back 3 years, crikey, what happened? I think there's a recognition of a thing called a global crisis that has affected just about every single human on the planet. There's only a few remote tribes who don't know about COVID. It's the first genuinely global phenomenon, I think, that has affected everybody in a short period of time. And I've seen a read across from that into some of these other crises. People have gone, oh yeah, I get what you mean about the climate crisis. That's going to affect us all, isn't it? So yes, indeed, that is the point. But just at the moment when we get the recognition that there is a common problem that we all face, and there are a number of them, as I said, a number of intersecting ones, that at that moment of recognition also increases stress, anxiety, worry about whether we can do anything about it. In short, whether I can do something, or my family can do something, or my community, or my colleagues, or back to me again. So I think I've seen an increase in kind of stress and anxiety, particularly amongst young people. And the surveys show this. Under 25s, top two concerns are social inequality and climate crisis. Top personal concern is stress and anxiety and mental ill health. So I think there's a congruence of these sorts of things. I've had people say to me in audiences at the end of talks, particularly the old saying, why should I bother? I had people say, you know, I'm going to die soon. Why should I bother doing anything different? And I've heard the young say, what can I do that actually makes a difference when the problem has been produced by, you know, you lot, kind of thing. So there's a kind of, you know, a sense of wanting to take agency, but creating people kind of concerned about what they can actually do about things. So this is where I'm tempted as the speaker to give evidence and data. And I've realized that that is completely the wrong thing to do. So when people say, yes, but, you know, kind of whataboutery sort of thing. Yes, but all of those kind of electric cars that you're talking about, what about, you know, this or that? And actually, if people are taking that view, whatever I say from the standing up or from the top table, presenting evidence and data is going to have no effect. It's actually just going to push people back further into a preformed position. Maybe over a longer period of time, things can change, but in a single event, if people are deniers already, you're not going to change them. So to convince people, I've tried to kind of think about the stories that we can tell that open up the space for people thinking about the problems that we face, or indeed the opportunities. So I would say, let's assume everyone knows it's bad. And I do use the 80-20 rule in my mind to kind of think that in any particular audience, 80% of people are going to get it, 20% are not. They may be relatively quiet, or they might be quite noisy. Maybe it's slightly different here. I'm looking around the audience. Who's in the 80s and 20s? Probably not very much. It's probably not 80 to 20 in our universities, is it? But in public audiences, I say, and people quite often say, well, how do we persuade within my community the deniers? And my answer has been to say, ignore them. Don't bother. Let them come along later, because I think 80% of people are in a good place, but they want some pointers as to what to do. So don't worry about the others, because you'll just create an argument and you'll go away more stressed because you won't have persuaded them. In Kimberly Nicholas's book, Under the Sky We Make, really nice kind of narrative, Pulitzer Prize winner, she used 4 little couplets as a little kind of story to say, this is all you need to know. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad. That's all you need to say, in a sense. That's all you need to know, right? All the other kind of data, we can marshal it, but and I find that quite interesting. The one little analogy that I use quite often is one that you may have heard before, which is to say, okay, we're trying to keep global temperatures under 1.5. Difficult, definitely under 2, but that's going to be serious if we get to that point. We're at plus 1.2 at the moment. But then, of course, that doesn't sound like very much for most people, because we think this morning it was -6, and now it's kind of +4, and this afternoon it might be 8 or 10. In other words, we think of temperature changes as to do with the daily changes that we feel. So I don't think that the saying to people, the world has warmed up by 1.2 degrees actually connects. People say, well, that's good, isn't it? That's not very much. It's kind of fine, isn't it? So my story behind that is to talk about body temperature, is to say, well, the planet is a homeostatic body. It self-regulates clearly, as we know, as Lovelock and Lynn Margulis and others talked about initially, controversially, but we understand that to be the case now. And the body is a homeostatic. The warm bodies are homeostatic as well. So I say to people, well, look, think about this. The planet's warmed up by 1 degree. If our body temperature goes up by 1 degree, we know we are ill. Okay, we know that. If it goes up by 2 degrees, you have a serious fever. It's definitely something that's stopping you doing anything. You're on your back, probably. If it's up by 3 degrees, you're in hospital. If it's up by 4 degrees, you're dead. Now, there's a kind of slight variations on that, and people have argued with me and say, oh, it's not. So that's not the point. I'm just trying to get you to think differently. And they say, well, I could survive 4. And I say, fine. Of course you might, in extremis. But 1 degree is enough to make you feel ill. So the planet is already ill. So I'm deliberately trying to use a kind of language which connects to our personal experience to get people to think about the climate challenge and to say 1.2 is bad already, 1.5. Of course I could and I would, I think perhaps in the past I said, well, at 1.5 degrees, it's going to look like this on the coast. And at 2 degrees, you're going to have the salt water lapping at the shores of Norwich kind of thing, and so forth. And actually people either know it or they don't believe it. So don't bother. Just go with something else. So body, and this is the one I get the most feedback on. I get people saying, I really understand that because you've created a different little bit of a story. Third example is a little riddle that I sometimes say to people. What links, and these are 2 of the countries that feature in Sea Sagas, what links Iceland, Norway, Albania, Costa Rica, and Paraguay? Smallish countries, yes. Anybody? I bet you know the answer here in the room. Anybody got any ideas? Willing to throw them out? Very talkative here in UEA.
Just read the countries out again, Jules.
Norway, Iceland, Norway, Albania, Costa Rica, and Paraguay. Probably, except Albania's all inland. So, yes, that's an outcome measure rather than an input measure. No, although, no, I mean, kind of one of those countries, yes, quite significant. Okay. Small countries, odd mix, perhaps, you might think, all 100% renewable in terms of electricity supply. Albania, 100%. Next door, Serbia, with the same geography and geology, Serbia is 0.2%. Serbia relies on all of its energy supply from Russian gas. Albania, 100% renewable from hydro. So I'm not saying hydro is perfect, it has problems, but it's a lot better than using 99.8% gas. So some smaller countries are doing interesting things. These 5 countries are all at 90%. Kenya, Ethiopia, Uruguay, Kazakhstan, and Namibia, all at 90%. The Kazakhstan leader, the big meeting of the stans with Putin and with Xi Jinping and others in Asia in the autumn, the Kazakhstan, I don't mean Kazakhstan, I mean Tajikistan, I'm sorry, not Kazakhstan. I have that in my mind because I was reading about Mark Cavendish this morning, cyclist, but separate story. The Kyrgyz leader kept Putin waiting for an hour for a meeting because they are 90% renewable already and they don't rely upon fossil fuels. So there's a read across from the decisions that are made about, of course there are read across, from the decisions made about the climate and addressing them into politics, into institutions, into kind of global interactions very quickly. And this is what we will see as we make transitions towards net zero. They're going to fundamentally change the nature of all sorts of things. So a question then is, how do we get started? How do we make it happen? And how do we navigate those paths? Because once we start on the path, then other objections emerge. You know, as I hinted just now, you say, well, Norway is now 85% of all vehicles are electric vehicles now, okay, because of subsidies and support. So they make the transition. And then people might say, well, yeah, that's all very well, but what about lithium and where you're going to get it from? And lithium mining in Congo, and then Sweden discovers lithium last week, big deposit. So maybe that kind of changed things. So the point is that none of these things stay the same. But if you get on a different path, we can ask new questions. So I want to go to that point of the starting of the path, how we get agency happening. And this is all about stories and tales. We humans have always used stories and tales to make sense of the world, gather around the fire, flickering shadows, children with upturned faces and wide eyes, listening to stories, falling asleep in the shadows, heroic journeys, quests, what we have always done. The Navajo Diné storyteller, Yellow Man, famous storyteller, writing a lot in the 50s and 60s, said, if children hear stories, they will grow up to be good people. So stories are about kind of understanding how we navigate the world, the norms, they tell us about morals, about right and wrong. So as we're gathered around the fire, we hear about how the world works, and we can take assumptions from them without being told what is right and wrong. So I think there's a kind of important point there. Stories are not about instruction. They're about revealing the way that we interact with the world and the way that we live our lives. And we hope by telling them that we will then get something from the story that we haven't been, as it were, instructed them. So if I say to you, a girl on a golden afternoon follows a white rabbit down a hole, you kind of know what the story is, probably most of you. And that's a relatively recent one, Alice in Wonderland. So she goes down the story and all sorts of magical things happen in this other place, shrinking and growing and mad hatters and mad queens and the whole works. And she comes back from special world into ordinary world at the end of it with some lessons learned. So that's the kind of narrative structure of many heroic journeys. A girl with locks of gold is in a dark forest. She comes upon a charming cottage. The door is open. She goes in the cottage. Don't go in the cottage. You think, no, don't do that. She goes in. There's 3 bowls of porridge. don't eat the porridge. She tries all the porridge. 3 beds, she sits in all the beds. She falls asleep in one. You say, don't fall asleep in the bed. And the bears come back. And so we have this kind of story, and the bears are kind of important agents in the story. There haven't been bears in Britain since 450 AD, not wild ones. And yet we quite happily will understand and tell a story about Goldilocks and the 3 bears. And we don't, nobody says, well, actually, you know what? There are no bears in Britain. How can you tell that story? Because it just is a story, isn't it? Ali Smith, in her first of the 4 series of books she wrote about the seasons, the first one, Winter, she said, well, perhaps the girl went in the house and sprayed the walls with graffiti, and that's why the bears were so cross. So there could be other things going on. I mean, why would she go into a cottage with the doors open? Why did the bears leave it open in the first place? No, it's going to be slightly more than that, Tim. Yeah, there will, but I've already alerted it. It's a little bit more than that because I want to do a reading for you in a moment. Cinderella, there are 500 versions of the story Cinderella from across Europe. A hugely important, particular kind of story that is embedded in many kinds of cultures. A boy called Jack swaps his cow for some beans. Of course, they were magic beans. And you think that's a, bright boy, good lad, moving away from a meat-based society and dairy into vegetarian, speaking as somebody from that side. But another story that tells us about kind of how magic things happen. Joseph Campbell in 1949 wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Really important kind of anthropological study of the way that stories have kind of common structures and often relate to the journeys that we personally go on in life, heroic journeys that we go through. And sometimes we choose them and sometimes they happen to us. You go from small school to big school, you go from big school to college, you get married, somebody dies, you have an accident, something happens. All through our lives, big challenges we face, and we have to travel through those, taking these kind of heroic journeys. Campbell said this, he said, when you enter the forest at its darkest point, at your darkest hour, there is no path. The idea is to make your own way. So I think we're in the darkest forest at the moment, and there isn't a path because we haven't done this net zero thing before. We haven't addressed this climate crisis in this sort of way. It's never happened. So we've got to make our own path. So for me, story is about journey, thresholds, stepping over the threshold and going into the dark forest, making your path, finding the elixir, the answers to the problems, and then coming back again. And you know what happens when you come back on a great journey? Someone says, oh, that's great, you're back. Fix the gate, would you? Because it's broken. It's about time you did the washing or whatever it is. You're back into ordinary world from the special world of the journey. That's kind of what happens. So how do you get across the threshold? Well, in almost every human storytelling tradition, there are tricksters. There are tricksters who help us get across the threshold. Tricksters are also healers in many contexts. They're often animals, sometimes plants. The great hare, the hare is the trickster in all East Anglian traditions of folk tales and stories. The hare is an important way of kind of making us think differently. You have coyote, raven, fox, Eshu, who is the Yoruba trickster, Circe. You also have Obi-Wan Kenobi, Gandalf, Hagrid, the Pied Piper. All of these characters are tricksters. They get us to think differently and to realize that we need to kind of go on a journey. Sometimes they behave in a particular kind of way that makes us think, oh, that's terrible. And then you respond to that through the kind of the moral content of the story. John Cage was a trickster, the composer, the American composer. In 1952, he had performed his piece called 4 minutes 33. Some of you will be nodding and you know the background to this. This was performed in in Maverick County in upstate New York. Audience came, the old kind of windy courthouse. Everybody sits down. He's there, one of America's foremost composers. Musicians are all present. 4 minutes 33 is completely silent. And that's all it is. So he sits there, the musicians sit there, the audience sits there, and he says, we'll start now. And then what do you think? You come to a show and there's nothing but silence. So probably you're thinking you're a bit pissed off to begin with. You know, come all of this way to hear this? And then they hear the owls calling outside, and then they hear the wind blowing through the walls, and rodents scurrying beneath the old building, and people rustling and making little kinds of noises. So into the silence comes a whole range of other things that people haven't noticed before, which was Cage's whole point, is that the silence is to make you think about stuff. And there's a Tuscan proverb that says, a tale is not beautiful if nothing is added. So the whole point about storytelling is not to instruct about one way of the world working, but to create a platform of interactions from which we take different things. But then that leads us into a space that that we understand the world in a slightly different way. So Tim, having kind of given me a nudge, I still would like to.
Still wonderful stuff. I'm only giving you a nudge so we have a discussion.
I understand. So what I want to do is just to read you an excerpt from Sea Sagas of the North, and this is a piece, and this is about 4 minutes, and then I'm going to take about a minute to finish up. Looking at the chair here.
Got you.
Okay, so settle down, everybody. No, seriously, this is a piece called "Drowning of Doggerland." Doggerland is the name for what was the North Sea. The North Sea once was dry and then was flooded because of rising sea levels at the end of the last period of cold climate in the Northern Hemisphere. And the people who lived there, now we know, there were hunter-gatherers living on what is now under what is now the North Sea. And so this story is about what happened, what I imagined happened, when the people were forced to leave by the rising sea. The question is, when they were forced to leave, did they meet with kindness at the coast or not? So you can see a kind of contemporary context. So I'm just going to read the first bit. This is alliterative prose, like kind of lyric verse. So deliberate use of language in a certain kind of way. I'm just going to read the first bit and then a couple of other verses, and then we'll kind of stop at that point. Just to give you a sense of what I hope what storytelling can do. So this is called The Drowning of Doggerland. So if you want to kind of settle down a bit, close your eyes, have a little snooze if you want. You're sitting by the fire, listening to the story. This is how it goes. It is said the sky people once were numerous, but they had drowned, and every dark hide of land and fire pit, each vale and fell, had been seized by the rising flood. The swell of sea had beaten down defence, so they launched their boats, lashed and loaded auroch skin, and flexed the oars. Among the firs and flutes were sobbing infants, fastened tight to strakes of birch. At last ahead appeared a strip of land. They saw a hall upon the cliff. It seemed no spell they cast, no cry to gods by these blue-eyed people who could beat the wind and slip with bow inside the range of creatures on the hunt. It seemed they could not counter how a poison had been cast that sunk their world, their land that fell before the ceaseless tide, as does the oak before the axe. The brine now bore them on toward a beach where figures stood in shadows under sighing pines. The squadron now drew near. The forest people watched this ragged fleet approach. They drew ash bows, for this had been a year of sure attacks and sorrow. So took the strain. Herne the king called to arms Away the anchors, sail round the flanks. Yet Queen Ursa was renowned, her long sight best in tribe, and she now observed, there are babies in those boats. I see no shields arrayed. We should pause and help these people come ashore. After countless battles, Herne, the fabled hunter, now could see these folk were people fleeing demons, and to his elite platoon he ordered, stow your bows and lance, but be on guard, send reserves to ride and help. A tall woman stepped ashore from the leading vessel. Others staggered at the land. Hands pulled the boats through breakers. An infant fell, and Ursa shouted to the rescue party, watch those children. One was face down in the wash. The boat people scattered over sands and dunes, gazed up at mottled sky, muttered thanks to gods of solid land, and drank from skins of water that the forest people proffered, who now could see this was the hour for a rescue, not an echo of the days when flames were lit on seaward ridge and summit to wreck on rocks such passing ships, nor would they need to darken skies, firing arrows at marauders. Sit with us, hailed the green king of wooden Sweden from his splendorous hall. Here is roasted meat and honey. Our trees are dense with fruit. Here is draught for all to drink. And the dark-skinned woman, her one eye crimped, stood tall before a people, bowed to king and queen, thanked them for their kindness, said quietly, we have come far. Our homes have drowned. And the king motioned, lay your goods on polished floor. You are safe to rest with us. The king paused by his sergeant. Send a party to the pines and dig the pits for those bodies lying on the shore. And said to leader, her name was Sky Rider of the shore. Our people live in marveled woods. We will tell how our children run with deer and elk, how this to us is paradise. And Ursa smiled. When you fully rested, you must voice the story of your people and this soak. But first we all will walk and give our prayers together for these babies lied in tiny graves. So like Homeric stories, there is in a story within a story. You hear how Sky Rider and her people are forced to leave the land. And I just want to read one final little moment, a psychological moment that happens to the people who live on Doggerland, which then becomes Dogger Isle. Gulls seethed about the shore, sooty petrel plunged, cold cried the cormorant. I knew it was another sign. This is her speaking. We could not tame the tempest. All our shamans tried. Had we eaten fish forbidden? Had a snake whispered in the grass? No one could recall. It seemed we had been fastened inside a frightful spell. And one sharp dawn came a shocking sight. The sun star rose from water, later slipped into the western waves. So that's part of a story called The Drowning of Doggerland.
Date?
Date. It's very interesting. Well, it's written by me. Oh, when it happened, 6000 BC. I actually had somebody write to me from the Netherlands recently, just a hint of this. Charming letter. She said, where did you discover the story? Were you able to find it in a cave or in ancient writings? Which I thought was lovely, actually, because I kind of rather like the idea of that. Let me finish with an observation then. I've given you a thing called 30 for 30. 30 ideas on how to reduce our personal carbon. And all I'm going to say is our average carbon dioxide production per person in the UK is about 7.5 tons on the backside here. So I quite often in talks then spend a bit of time saying, here are 30 ideas for 2030 as to how to reduce our personal carbon footprints. So lots of options. But the key point to this, I say, is create your individual story. Choose one of these per year for the next 7 years. And you know what will be a large way towards cutting our total carbon in the country by 50% by 2030, because there are a range of options here. So I've tried to kind of say to people, this is us in the dark woods. Here are a range of paths. You choose the path, but please take one and then take another one. Start in a different point. If you can deal with the food side of things, well, there's some easy options there, but that may not be possible or preferable. So can you go to somewhere else? So the idea of using these kind of 30 ideas is not to create an argument about the numbers. I think they're pretty well based, but you could argue about exactly what the carbon footprint of the UK is. Do you include trade? Do you include the costs of cutting down forests in the Amazon? Do you include this or that? Actually, what I'm interested in is just to say, here's a way of seeing the options that sit in front of us. We all need to take a step. In a sense, what's your step? What's the step that each of us can take? Some of these we may have been doing already. Of course, the problem is if you're doing some already, they don't count towards the future because we've still got to cut emissions by 50%, but at least people are in the game. So if we can get everybody in the game in some sort of way, then that's the trickster action to say, now we're taking a kind of path into the future. I will finish by saying, I think kind of one of the tricks in all of this is not to talk about stopping bads, but to talk about creating goods. So you could spend a lot of time talking about how bad the climate crisis, how bad the biodiversity crisis, social inequality one. At the end of that, you just feel kind of like, yeah, I knew all of that, but I just feel worse now because you've told me all of that. I can find it. So how do we create goods? A sense of what good looks like. I think that's an open question. I have some ideas, but I think everybody has some thoughts as to what the good world, a good life, a good way of living looks like that actually protects the planet. So I'm trying to bring things around to the goods, hence this story of Doggerland. It's bad they have to leave, but what happens when they do make the movement? Are they going to be faced with goodness? I stop with two little quotes. One of friend of mine, writer J. Griffiths. I'm going to have to find the right page here. All sorts of little kind of bits and bobs here. Writer J. Griffiths had a book published last year. No, it's 2021 now, sorry. Called Why Rebel, or it could be Why Rebel. I think it's kind of quite clever, actually. But she said this bit. She said, in Oxford Circus, I was passed a handwritten note. It said, I can't get arrested because I'm only 10, but thank you for doing this for me. She'd been on activist movements and trying to kind of change things, and somebody had seen that, recognized that. And Mary Oliver, wonderful US poet, wrote in a poem called Wild Geese. She died 3 years ago. She said, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert. So part of the kind of problem in all of this space is making it seem difficult. So of course it is difficult because otherwise we wouldn't be worried about it in the first place. But then there's a little twist where it's actually, you know what, there's a way we can deal with this. And Paul Hawken, in his wonderful book called Regeneration, this kind of bringing together of ideas from 100 different people, he said in there, you know, it's not your job to save the planet. And I say this a lot when I speak to school groups. I say, it's not your job to save the planet. You can't do it. I can't do it. You can't do it. But it is your job to take one step. And that one step is a kind of gift, because that may then lead to the agency of bringing other people to take the step as well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, Jules, there are not many lectures I hear where I feel a sense of levitation. And I would be very surprised if anyone in this room doesn't feel better for coming in at 1 o'clock today and hearing what you had to say. And that tells you volumes. Tells you, first of all, you got your message across, which you did, but also tells you that the message is one not just of hope, but there are a number of cuts, C or K in here. There's connectedness, there's kindness, there's compassion. There's the idea of making something happen, because if you do something, you can't be faulted. And then you can be stronger in relation to someone else. If you've done something and you say to somebody, why don't we all do it together? Yeah. I made my small step. You're not preaching to them, you're demonstrating something. And we can't do this by not doing it ourselves. You don't become an effective teacher, in my view, unless you're actually an effective player. So your presentation has been, to me, a revelation for how we in universities should function. The narrative is not just a narrative. It's a form of expression, a form of relationship, a form of understanding and connecting to the next generation. That wonderful statement about the little boy saying, I'm only 10, is very powerful. I'll leave you with this thought, and then I'm going to have some questions. But imagine if the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, who was on the television in COP27 with the water rising above his knees, had read that piece from the Dogger Bank. How much more powerful that would have been than what he said. And that tells you 6,000 years of volume. So it's a remarkable thing. My friends, here's a chance for you to express your views in any way you like. I think Natasha or somebody has got a roving microphone. We have to use the microphone because of our friends who are in the ether, who are very much, I'm sure, part of the same feeling that we have in here. Who would like to make a contribution of any kind to Jules? It's a wonderful opportunity to do so.
Hi. Thank you for that amazing lecture. I wanted to ask how stories could be a tool to empower society. I guess, I mean, you've already explained it, but my concern is this kind of like didacticism when it comes to storytelling that tells climate change. It usually is a blaming game and fatalistic even. And so I'm curious in terms of like, how do we make sure that stories pertaining to the climate crisis doesn't operate in a fundamentalist kind of reading of how to be green and how to be solving all of this problem. And as you put it, you know, it's like a collective action, and that's how, I guess, like, you know, you move forward. We move forward the conversation.
Very good, really good point. Yeah, this is a really. I mean, I don't have a kind of firm answer, but I've got a couple of observations. One is absolutely your point is there's a continuous danger, and you find yourself, I find myself very easily slipping into what I think is right and wrong. And because I've kind of, you know, read a lot of stuff and I know a lot of things, but actually that's a danger of implying that those who know it correctly are sitting up here and those who don't are sitting down there. Let me use that kind of in a metaphorical sense. So how do we create that space between the kind of binaries, between the kind of fundamental rights and wrongs, so that there's a space for action, agency, addressing things? I think that's the challenge. That's what we need to do. Certainly most of the popular narratives and stories around the climate crisis, whether novels or films, are highly dystopian. You know, the world is really about to be wrecked. That's kind of, you know, that might make good novels and good films, but actually perhaps just makes us more kind of anxious and concerned because somebody's saying this is what it's going to look like. And so actually what that might do to a lot of people is then to say, well, you know what, I give up all of this stuff, forget it, you know, I'll just carry on doing the same, because you're saying it's inevitable, are you? So it's an open question, then how do we create those narratives in the middle that around hope, around kind of examples of doing things well? And we have a program of work around what we call evidence of hope and evidences of hope, to use the plural, although it's a little bit clunky. Well, where people are doing interesting things around the world that we can point towards that say, you know what, they're doing something really interesting over here. Solar engineers in Bangladesh, renewable power in the Scottish Islands, those 100% countries that I mentioned already. Did you think that Albania was a bit of a basket case? Well, it's not, actually. It's 100% renewable. In other words, you can open up a little bit of a kind of space that says we're not starting all of this stuff from as it were a kind of ground zero where nothing has happened. Lots of people are doing things. And as Tim said, you can also say, well, actually, you know, I do the following with my diet, I do the following with my transport, I do the following in my community. And you hope to kind of just inspire a little bit of action with that. But I think you've hit upon a really, really good point, and just hold that.
Gentleman here, and then Adrian.
Hi, thank you for a provocative talk. It's interesting that you opened with Brecht, and it's become almost a cliche to say now part of the crisis, the climate crisis, is a crisis of storytelling, because of course if we're taking the hero's journey, which is, as we know, a very white male form of storytelling, and we apply it to I do everything on the flyer on my quest, and it makes no difference, because actually the individual hero doesn't really have power over the world on this hill that we need to affect change. Whereas Brecht kind of, you know, in the 20s and 30s acknowledged the failure of traditional narrative and was actually using epic theatre, the saga that's on the to avoid traditional narrative and open a space, a theatre space, as Augusto Boal does later, for social discussion, for change, for political and economic theory. So it's actually part of the problem with the storytelling about this climate crisis that we are stuck in those, you know, what quote unquote traditional narrative protagonist-led stories, and we need to actually deconstruct those before we can find the new narratives which enable us to confront this crisis.
Very good point. Yes, so kind of Campbell's 1949 book is almost entirely filled with male characters. Maria Tata from Harvard just produced a really, really nice book called The Heroine with 1001 Faces that came out earlier this year. And she makes the really good point to say the stories emerge from a particular kind of social and political milieu, and we've got to keep trying to break those and to break down the kind of norms that are inside them. Most of those examples that I gave you of tricksters are male characters, not female ones. And there have been lots of people trying to say, think about this differently. And Maria Tata's book is superb because she does that. And you make the point that all of this is set within a political space anyway. So one has to take on power and the way that politics works, and the way that if we feel there's a particular way of doing things, we have to get into that space and kind of, you know, use sharp elbows to make things happen. I give you one example. It's not exactly the thing about the story, but how to act in the politics. I hinted at this earlier on with the Essex Climate Action Commission. Our report has 100 recommendations in it, and I worked really hard with every political party in Essex to get them all to agree to all 100 NEMCOM. Not, I quite like that one, but not that one. So I wanted them to agree to the whole tabula rasa, as it were, to say that's the space in order for us to move forward. And we've created, in surprising political spaces, a lot of support for thinking about the climate crisis in a different way. In a county, I think you probably wouldn't think that would be likely or effective. And that's a kind of form of storytelling. So deploying ways of bringing people on. So I think you're absolutely right. We need expertise in narrative, story, in every form, whether performative or written or song or TikTok or whatever it is. let's use every kind of media to be able to say this is what we are each doing. We may then promote some new forms of kind of agency that follows that. But I'm interested in that bit, the leap from the story into the action, really.
Thank you, Jules. It was wonderful. I suppose the thing I'm sort of thinking about a bit is whether there can be too many stories in a way. And we often sort of think of the example of Obama when he was trying to get his healthcare policy through, and politicians understand these things. And he said, you know, I failed because I didn't tell a good enough story. And I suppose that means that other people told a competing story which was somehow more powerful. And when it comes to sort of environmental concerns, there's any number of different stories that arise out of people's worldviews. Some might tell a story based on green economy, others on degrowth, others on Ubuntu relational philosophies, you know, whatever. There's endless. So I suppose, you know, that's, you know, do we want 1,000 stories to flourish? Is that itself what's going to help us? Or is there some way in which we need to sort of think about good and bad stories and which stories we want?
Yeah, really good. I don't think there's a simple kind of answer to that. I think I would stray on the more the better, but then kind of, you know, who's chairing the next COP next year? You've probably seen, you know, it's the head of the.
It's the head of the oil industry.
Exactly, in the UAE. There you go. I'm trying to remember his name. It's escaping. So, you know, that's a kind of claiming of a territory with a particular kind of washing aim, I assume. Same with sports washing and other kinds of things that are going on from the petrostates. So I think there is a kind of competitive element in this, of trying to kind of say stuff that you hope will have some connection and congruence with people, and that will get enough people into a space of action that then they can choose the bits that they want. So I think it's quite difficult, but I do think there's a creative, intellectually interesting, fascinating space that can be made in all of this, which isn't the dystopian one that you mentioned earlier. Well, you didn't mention, but I kind of read into that. So let's kind of get away from that and say, in that middle ground between this and that, isn't it interesting? Because we don't actually know the answers yet. We've got to kind of find new forms of every kind of scientific, literary, film, theatre type of storytelling that allows people to kind of go, oh, that's interesting. Perhaps I'll do something different as a result of it. So I do have a kind of normative element to it. I want to kind of to go beyond just, as it were, art for art's sake, but something that scientists are able to say, yes, we need to write papers in the following way and do this kind of rigorous analysis. But when I talk to communities, I'm going to be talking in a slightly different way. So it's a kind of both and argument rather than an either or one.
Natasha, do you want to say something about Awaken Up? Because I'd like to say a few words at the end. I'll give you ground first.
Yes, just a couple of questions online, which are slightly related to what Adrian said, from George and Kay. One of them is around, could you say a little bit about the role of the storyteller and the need for that storyteller to be trusted and speak to the values of their audience? Because often climate activists are talking at their audience and building around their own values and not of that of the audience. And Kay was taking that forward and saying, what about creating spaces for storytellers who have been traditionally marginalised rather than the ones that are traditionally heard, so like the indigenous communities and farming communities? And could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think the key is creating the kind of opportunities, what we might call the kind of platforms for action, literally in this case on the platform, whereby people are able to reflect their own experiences, and you've got to kind of set the scene a little bit in terms of, well, look, these are the challenges that we'd like to discuss. This is, you understand this in a particular kind of way. Here are some ways of thinking about the world, and here are some ways of acting within it. What do you think? So I think kind of always turning, I do a lot of community group work, and the kind of observations and questions that people have from their own communities are always interesting, often unique, and give a kind of particular perspective on all of this. So I think if we're in a listening mode, we kind of hear that, and then we can kind of say, well, that's interesting. Here's some, I hope, reasonable guidance as to how to turn that into agency and action. So moving from a sort of helplessness into, and then for those voices that have been deliberately silenced over many years, decades, cultures, whole periods of time, then I think you have to be deliberately helping people to come forward in order to create the space for them to tell their stories, because people are used to being well silenced, really. So I think one has to be quite positive about that. You can't just say, as you're saying, Adrian, just kind of open it up. You have to say, okay, over to you now. Want to hear your side of things, and that may need some prep, some help, some support, all of those kinds of things. So again, I think it's an interesting creative space for thinking about how we move from talking about how we live into talking about how we act. And we know for sure one particular thing: the world will completely change with the climate crisis, either because we do it before the crisis or afterwards. I'd hope it will be beforehand, because then we can guide it. Otherwise, we'll be heading for the dystopian bit that we heard about there.
Now, friends, we're just at the point of two where I think our remote